Good afternoon and welcome to the East Building Auditorium. I'm Eric Denker, one of the senior lecturers on the staff, and this is the first in our series of Sunday afternoon lectures on parts of the permanent collection of the West Building. And it will be followed by various talks on Venetian art, on American art, on Italian and French art as well. I'm starting with the collection of the Dutch paintings in the gallery, and we'll need to do a little background before we discuss individual works. So before you are portraits of Andrew Mellon and of Peter Widener, Mellon on the left side, done by Oswald Bierly, and Widener, done by John Singer Sargent in 1902, here on the right. Their collections helped set the tone of the National Gallery collections, along with Joseph Widener, Samuel and Rush Kress, and the founders of the National Gallery. They were interested in iconic art. They were interested in major names and in important passages of those artists' careers. And so we know, for instance, that in Mellon's collection, there were 4 Van Dycks, 5 Frans Hals, 7 Rembrandts, and a Vermeer. In Peter Widener's collection, there were 14 paintings that were attributed to Rembrandt, 8 Van Dycks, a Vermeer, 3 paintings by Hobbema, and 1 by Ruysdael. And these are all major names. They weren't interested, per se, in diversity and being representative. Instead, they wanted to have significant acknowledged artists. And not only were they interested in iconic work, but they had certain personal interests. And so they valued a certain emotional restraint. They valued a certain decor. And so you won't find in their collections violent painting or paintings that are emotionally or sexually charged. And yet, Dutch painting in the 17th century was really much more diverse. This portrait of Adrian van Ostade by Hals is a good example of the kind of work that they valued. Instead, we see the collection today as being much more varied. And in order to appreciate what is unique about the Dutch collection, we have to set the stage, both historically and politically. And so to begin, a map. A map that shows the Low Countries between 1609 and 1672. The area that you see toward the top of the slide are the United Netherlands, what we would now consider to be Dutch art coming from this region. The lower areas in the brighter color remained under Spanish control, present-day Belgium. And we refer to that as Flemish art when we talk about 17th century painting. If we're discussing Netherlandish art, in general, we talk about this whole region prior to 1600. So that's a distinction we make right from the beginning. This is an area that was held as part of the Holy Roman Empire in the first half of the 16th century. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had been born in Ghent. And during the Reformation period, when the Protestant Church first made advances in this area, he tended to be rather tolerant. When he abdicated and his son Philip II of Spain took over the reins of the empire, he felt much more strongly about religious orthodoxy. Based on the dictums coming out of the Council of Trent, he wanted to quash the Reformed Church and any kind of infidelity to Catholic beliefs. And so we know he had a very heavy hand on the Netherlands, starting in the 1550s and into the 1560s. A general revolt in 1566 was the iconoclasm in which great monuments of Catholic belief, of altar pieces and statuary, were destroyed. And then outright hostilities were declared in 1568, and we date this as the beginning of the 80 Years' War, or the Dutch War of Independence. It lasts for approximately 50 years initially, when it's just the Spanish and the Dutch involved. And then in 1609, there is a 12-year truce that is signed. And this is very important for us because it is that moment during that 12-year period that the economy in the major cities of the Netherlands begins to boom. There is a great demand for art and for luxury items. Trade, maritime trade, takes off. We know the trade consisted of fish, woolen products, dairy products. They imported a good deal of wheat and lumber. Their ships were the envy of other nations. And so we have this moment of economic boom, which is furthered by the Dutch East and West Indies companies, both established in the first decade of the 17th century. They are, in fact, the first publicly owned multinational corporations, and they contribute greatly to the economy. Now, because of the Reformation, there were fewer commissions coming from the church. The Reformed Church didn't value imagery in the same way that the Catholic Church did. And we know that there was relatively sporadic patronage from the royal family in The Hague, from the House of Orange. And therefore, a number of factors changed in the market that helped to define what was going on in the arts in the century and will lead to the definition of our own galleries. So the first of these is that there is an intense specialization. We know that this is a period of intense competition. One scholar has speculated that as many as 50,000 paintings were done each year in a country approximately the size of Maryland. And so competition was intense. Craft was very high. Prices were relatively low. And the market now was not the church or important royal families. The market now was a burgeoning middle class, a merchant class, a rising class. And it's the first age of dealers and auctions and fairs where paintings were sold. And so a good deal of this work was done on speculation rather than by commission. This led to specialization. If an artist became known in one area, landscape, interiors, everyday life, portraiture, they tended to stay within their recognized area. And therefore, the developments occur within those various different subjects, within those topics. Because of that, the Dutch galleries here at the National Gallery are arranged thematically. They are the exception that proves the rule. All of the other sections of the gallery are arranged chronologically by region. Instead, in the Dutch area, they are arranged either by topic, portraiture, landscape, still life, Rembrandt, Haarlem School, or they are arranged because of size in the cabinet galleries, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So it would lead to an artist like Emmanuel de Witte, who did this painting of the interior of the Oude Kerk, the old church in Amsterdam, in 1660. He was a specialist in church interiors, along with a number of other artists who did the same. So we have this single example of his work. And as you look at the work, you will see that it is intended to be a fairly accurate representation of the architecture, of the space, of the light at the end of the day. Not that it was painted on the spot, these were all painted in studios, but it portends this idea that it's an accurate representation. As you look, you can see that there are human figures here, and they enact a small drama. And so there in the center, these men gesture down at an open grave, people being buried beneath the pavement in churches at the time. And they stand with their dog gesturing down, and there is a skull, so that we know that there is a certain idea that there is a contemplation of death, a kind of meditation on mortality. But amidst that specific narrative, there are other details to be read. And so amidst death, there is life. This peasant woman nursing a child, her bundles down on the floor, another child close by, and their family dog there as well. Well, one of the things about Dutch and Flemish painting that makes it different from French and Italian painting at the time is the idea that there is nothing too outlandish, nothing too vulgar for painting to portray. They felt that they inhabited God's world and that everything existed within that world was necessarily of God's making. And so as you look across the painting, you see these figures, and suddenly you come upon a dog lifting his leg, and we're not meant to understand this as anti-clerical. It is simply part of everyday life, as the man who's fallen asleep in the pews behind, just part of everyday life. And we will see that this occurs time and again within Dutch and Flemish painting of the 17th century. So that when we wander by this painting in the same room, work by Van der Heyden from 1670, this architectural caprice, we're not surprised as we look at the carefully wrought gate, the individual brickwork, the neoclassical building in the background. We're not surprised to come across, yet again, near the patron coming out through the gate, a dog lifting his leg. It was considered part of life and therefore appropriate. So we're dealing here with a particular topic, and that topic is the image of your surroundings. The Dutch were very proud of the country that they had wrought, their freedom, their culture, and they wanted to depict the world around them. And so we get this sense of them interested in their own environment, and they are, in fact, the first culture to give us this kind of broad panorama of where they lived, of their landscape, of their cityscapes, of their interiors, of public buildings, and of private spaces as well. This painting by Solomon Roesdael, the only one in the collection, done in 1649, is a river view with a ferry. It is among the very important acquisitions that we've made over the last 20 years. It is a painting that is remarkable in the breadth of the landscape, in the freshness of the landscape, and we acknowledge Roesdael as the artist who wrenches Dutch landscape painting out of a monochromatic period into a much more colorful and detailed period. As you look, you can see in the center that nice group of trees that help to define our space. Over to the right, you'll see the ferry boat with an array of different people, a few ducks in the water, and beyond, a few sailboats, perhaps a church in the distance. But look at the level of the horizon. How much of the painting is really given over to the spaciousness and the sense of these broad skies and the clouds as they rush across. And then, as we look to further detail, here, that ferry boat, and then suddenly we notice this small group of cows and bulls over on the left side, and there is a bull mounting a cow. Again, not to be considered illicit or vulgar, but part of everyday life. And so we get the full exploration of what that life on Earth means. The landscape collection is particularly outstanding. We have in the collection one of only a dozen landscapes by Rembrandt. And I am showing it to you here in the condition it was when I first arrived at the gallery back in the 1970s. This was a famous painting, a painting that had been celebrated while it was in Britain in the 19th and early 20th century, had been copied by one artist after another. And then Widener purchased the painting, and it was brought here to the United States, and we've had it here in the gallery. When the curators who arrived in the 1970s saw the painting, they recognized that it wasn't really what Rembrandt intended. That as you look at it, it was covered with a very dark film of varnish. And so the decision was made to clean the painting, and here it is in the process of being cleaned. You can see that horrible yellow varnish, which had led people to interpret it as a sundown. It was clearly not a sundown, but instead here is it as you see it today. And so conservation is a very important part of our story here as well. It is an important painting for us in that as you look at it, it was a painting absolutely symbolic of the collection that was in need of being restored to its original condition. And so as you look at it here, it's clearly not a storm. It is a windmill standing up. The storm seems to have passed. It's inhabited by the variety of different figures that you see down below. One of the important Dutch painters who was influenced by Italianate light was Albert Cuyp. And we have this Cuyp from about 1650. It is called the Maas at Dordrecht, the Maas being the name of the river, one of the rivers that comes together in Dordrecht. And it seems to represent a moment in Dutch history that in Dordrecht, in 1646, nearing the conclusion of the hostilities with Spain, the Dutch decided to have a show of strength. So 30,000 men and countless ships all assembled in Dordrecht. And that seems to be what this represents. And the ceremonial figures going up from the boat onto the larger ship seem to be officials of the town of Dordrecht, recognizable by the flat-top tower and over to the left by the old city gate. It is one of Cuyp's greatest landscapes. It's one of the most important landscapes in the collection. I would suggest that there is something else going on here as well, that the Dutch often included symbols and hints as to a greater meaning within their paintings. And so here, having looked very carefully, I spent some time examining the clouds. And we had an expert come in, some of you may know the name Bob Ryan, who came and looked at various paintings with us and talked about how accurate they were. It turns out that while these are beautiful depictions of clouds, they are not accurate. This is a high cloud. It never occurs that close to the horizon. And so that got me to thinking why the clouds were constructed in this way. We have literally hundreds of thousands of Dutch drawings of landscape, but very few of those drawings have the sky. The sky is an invention. It's an invention that's done in the studio. And it often is used to give greater resonance to the structure of the painting, the design and composition of the painting. But I think here there's something else as well. To the lower left is a map, a 17th century Blau map of Spain. And I think the cloud that's there in the center is deliberately an image of Spain being lifted off of the backs of the Dutch, off of the Dutch polder. This has not yet met with widespread agreement, but I'm hoping that it will enter into the literature. Maritime trade was essential to this economy, and we can see that here in this Rudolf Backhuizen of 1667 of these frigates in the storm. Shipping, very important, and if shipping is important, then weather conditions are essential as well. Therefore, the Dutch often had paintings that depicted ships. In this case, not along the Dutch shoreline, which has none of these kind of rocky outcroppings, but further from home, perilously close, with a bit of light to one corner, that upper left corner, that promises hope that there will be some surviving ships beyond the one that's already gone down. I mentioned earlier about the way in which the founders conceived of Dutch art. They were not enamored of Caravaggio, whose emotional, charged art was not necessarily to their taste, and therefore they weren't particularly interested in the followers of Caravaggio, either in Italy or in the North. And one of the gaps in the collection, when our curator came on the scene in the 1970s, was in the Utrecht Caravaggisti. And so we had the opportunity to add two of these, and that gives me pause to mention one other essential item, and that is that really the collection and this lecture is a great tribute to Dr. Arthur Wheelock, who was the gallery's first curator of Dutch and Flemish painting, and he served here at the National Gallery from 1973 until 2018. It was Arthur's connoisseurship, his research and writing, his astute acquisitions, his cultivation of like-minded donors, and his unique vision of the possibility of a representative collection of Dutch and Flemish painting that inform these galleries so brilliantly today, and we owe him a great debt of gratitude. That includes this painting by Ter Bruegen of a lute player, as well as the Gerrit Hahntorst Merry Company of 1623, two paintings heavily influenced by the artists having visited Italy, having seen the work of Caravaggio, and having brought that message back. But these paintings are interspersed into the late Flemish galleries. Stylistically, they seem closer there. Instead, the next gallery really is about portraits. And when we start with portraits, we start with Frans Hals. Born in Antwerp, but with his family for religious, social, political purposes, comes to Haarlem and becomes the first great portrait painter in the early part of the 17th century in the Netherlands. When we approach portraits, we always have to keep three factors in mind initially. And the first is the sitter. A portrait is, generally speaking, a commission. And therefore, the sitter gets some choice in how they want to be seen, just as when you go and have your photograph taken, you get certain choices. How you want to dress, how you want to be seen, your expression. Do you want to be happy or serious? The sitter has the same options, and the artist, if it's a commission, has to respect these choices. The next of these factors is how the artist feels about the sitter. This will come through to various extents. If it's somebody that they know and are fond of, it's unmistakable in the painting. If it's somebody that they are portraying particularly under duress, this will come through as well. The third factor is the one we most often overlook, and that is, what baggage do we bring to the painting? What do we think about the person if we know anything about them? Or what do we think about the class of person? Or their status in various ways? So we have to take all of these into account when we begin to approach a portrait. So here we see Hal's portrait of Willem Calmans. And Calmans here is seated and half-length and has just turned to look out at us. The chair is facing away from us. He's turned, he's thrown his arm over the chair. His body faces in one direction, his face in another. It's as if we've just interrupted him. And this is the way Hals chooses to animate the figure. The sitter undoubtedly selected Hals because of Hals' particular talents. His ability, in this case, to evoke this lace cuff, this embroidered sleeve, this newly fashionable collar. And here we come to a distinction we should always make in description. The difference between evoking and suggesting and recording or detailing. These are two different approaches. And here Hals, through his bravura brushwork, suggests those different textures. When we look at this figure, we can see that he doesn't betray a lot of emotion. He seems to be interested in connecting to us, but without speaking. You see his hat is on, kind of dandified angle with a little pom-pom, making him a little more approachable. But if I were to ask you to do a voice bubble above his head, I think you would probably come up with 100 or 200 different possibilities, because he doesn't really suggest anything specific. He looks out at us, perhaps a little bit aloof, but otherwise we can't read his thoughts. It's not that personal. I think that's very different from this painting, and this is why it was so important in 1999 for us to acquire this painting, which shows a different approach to portraiture in Haarlem at the same moment as Frans Hals. This is Andries Stilt as a standard bearer, as an ensign in a militia company. And it is done by the lesser-known Johannes Verspranck, a commission that was executed in 1640. So we go and we read the label, and it tells us that he's a standard bearer, but the label doesn't tell us who he's working for. In fact, he's working for a militia company. He's the standard bearer for them. And so he holds the standard, and we assume, wrongly, that this was the costume that the standard bearer had to wear. In fact, only the sash and the standard itself were necessary. The rest was his choice. And he could have picked Frans Hals, but no, he picks Verspranck. Why? Because Verspranck is a specialist in being able to produce the illusion of light passing across different textures. From that kid glove that he's wearing, to the satin and silk, to the lace piping, to the feather or the standard, to that lace collar or the ribbon that adorns it, or even the softness of his hair or the felt hat. That is what he desired. That was important to the sitter. And the pose. Look at this pose. He stands triumphant before us, full of confidence. In fact, I would go even further. He stands with one arm out, his head slightly back. Now, if you had to make a voice bubble for him, it would be very different. I think there'd be more widespread agreement. What is he thinking? He's thinking, feast your eyes. Knock yourself out. Just check me out. And not so very long ago, I had a group from the National Cathedral School, and when I asked that question, one of the young ladies just started to sing. And she started to sing, "I'm too sexy for my clothes, too sexy." And it was perfect. It was the perfect reply. Now, why does he pose in this way? Why does he want a painting of himself as an ensign? Because, in fact, we know that he had just gotten betrothed. And the following year, he would marry. And once you married, you couldn't be an ensign and you couldn't wear this costume. You had to wear a more restrained costume, such as Ostado wears here, the costume of a gentleman. And so it's somewhat nostalgic. He wants to remember what it was like when he could be part of the militia company. Now, I should tell you that the militia companies were important about 1600 and during the fight against Spain, but by this time they were largely ceremonial. They could be called out, similar to the National Guard, in emergencies, but in general, they were there for ceremonial purposes. They were parading on feast days, on civic holidays. It wasn't that they were so active, and so he's a member of a kind of club, and he wants to remember the camaraderie of being in that club. In the same room, we have one of the earliest paintings by a woman in the gallery, and this is a work, a self-portrait at about the age of 20 or 21 by Judith Leister. And when we talk about a self-portrait, we eliminate one of those factors because how the sitter wants to be seen is precisely the way the artist will see the sitter. And so, what does she want to communicate to us? It's clear that she wants to show that she's attractive, that she's happy, most importantly, that she's a painter. And it wasn't easy for a woman to be a painter in the early part of the 17th century in the Netherlands. It was difficult, not only to get training, but in terms of the rivalry with other artists. And she doesn't just want to tell us she's a painter. She wants to tell us she paints everyday subjects, genre scenes. She holds one brush in her hand. She holds a palette. Beneath the palette, there's an array of brushes that nobody who ever painted held while they were painting. It's a little bit over the top. And she's painting a violinist, a scene from everyday life. Again, her body is facing slightly more toward the canvas, but her head looks out toward us, as if we've interrupted her. We've come into the room. But as opposed to the Halds that we looked at, she's happy to see us. Her mouth is slightly open. She's happy to speak with us. You can imagine her saying, "Please have a seat. I'm just finishing up." Or we can speak while I'm painting. All of these are parts of the painting. And she sets herself a very difficult task. Look at that collar, that fine lace collar, the transparency of the cuff, the way in which the sleeve differs in texture from that cuff and from the wood of the chair beneath. And yet, it is precisely this which makes the painting a fiction, because nobody ever painted wearing this collar. How long do you think that collar would have stayed fresh and clean? No, undoubtedly she had somebody of the right size and shape pose in the costume while she was painting. Two other nice details here. First, as she looks out at us, the actual conceit is that she's looking at us, but what she's really doing is looking in a mirror. She needs a reflective surface to do a self-portrait. Beyond that, we had a large celebration in 2009 on the anniversary, the 400th anniversary of her birth. There are a variety of approaches to art history, biographical, or in terms of the marketplace, or in terms of different political philosophies. It's interesting to us that one of the scholars who spoke at the conference at that time suggested something that we hadn't come across before. And that is because she had difficulty with male artists, and we know that from other paintings and from her suit against Frans Hals for taking one of her pupils, that perhaps it's not entirely coincidental that she holds a sharp-pointed object at a vulnerable part of the male figure in the painting. You won't find that in the systematic catalog yet either. The portrait collection was enhanced more recently with this painting by Thomas de Keyser, the leading Amsterdam artist in the decade before Rembrandt arrives on the scene. It's a portrait of a gentleman wearing a fancy ruff. It was done in 1627. and it is painted on copper. The copper allows for the paint to sit on the surface without being absorbed whatsoever, and for you to be able, as an artist, to work a great deal of fascinating small detail into it. And so this is one consideration. And so here is that, I think, almost unbelievable painting of the collar and of the ruff in this way. And it's important to acknowledge at this point that this is one of many paintings that was provided to the gallery both by the individual donors and the fund that they set up by Lee and Juliette Folger. And the Dutch and Flemish collection has been greatly enhanced by their contributions. But if you had to identify one portrait that stands out, that becomes almost symbolic of the whole Dutch area, it would certainly be the Rembrandt self-portrait that you see here at the age of 53, done in 1659. Rembrandt, born in 1606, made a subset of his life's work self-portraiture. We know that there are approximately 50 surviving paintings, another 25 drawings, multiple etchings, and so we have an autobiography, visual autobiography of Rembrandt from about the age of 16 to his death at the age of 63. Our first thought, very often, is that somebody who did their own self-portrait 100 times must have been very vain. They must have wanted to reproduce their image over and over in a kind of 17th century selfie mode. And yet, the evidence belies this assertion. Because in fact, though there are some early paintings that are done clearly with the idea of vanity in mind, with a nobleman's breastplate or a fancy hairdo, most of the time he is exploring how the human face carries emotion, how physiognomy gives evidence of the deeper workings, interior workings of each human being. And we can see that when we look at that painting, or if we look at this drawing from early in his life in red chalk from the permanent collection, or in this painting where he's attempting to look surprised and carries that off very well. And again, he's probably at this point only in his mid-20s. We know that in the 20th century, Paul Ekman identified 6 basic human emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. And so we recognize those as major emotions. But what I'd like to assert here is that what makes Rembrandt so relevant to us today is his ability as an actor. Before you can portray yourself, you have to have the ability to physically describe these different emotions. And that's crucial to our understanding. And so I have often equated Rembrandt and self-portraiture with acting. Those 6 basic human emotions. Any actor, any of moderate range or less, is able to do those because they are obvious emotions. And often they are done by mugging, by putting on a kind of cliched expression, a mask, if you will, to be happy or to be sad or to be angry. Those are easy to portray. And without naming names, I think we recognize that distinction. People who perhaps might never appear on Masterpiece Theater. People who have certain basic roles that they inhabit. Instead, when we get to somebody like Rembrandt, we think of great actors. We think of those people who understand the range of human emotion and the subtleties in between those 6 basic human emotions. We don't really care what Rembrandt looked like 350 years after his death, which will be on October 4th this year. What we care about is the depth of understanding he portrays of the human condition. So when you look at this, it would be easy to say he's sad, but in fact, he doesn't use all of the artistic hints. He doesn't turn down the edges of his mouth. There's no tear in his eye. Instead, we look at this, and the adjectives that come to our mind are that he's sober, he's serious, he's contemplative. And yes, there might be some sadness here, and he's had difficulties in this decade in his life, but he chooses to portray this emotion. And it is a deliberate choice. It's not that he's always sad. It's not that he's always in this mood, but he chooses this and then portrays it in a way that remains relevant to us 350 years later. It is different than the kind of portrait he did that we have in the collection of his wife Saskia. And here, done within a year or two after they're married, we see this somewhat idealized image of Saskia, given this nice smile, given beautiful collar and jewelry, given the veil that was more associated with shepherdesses, which she never would actually have worn. Instead, it's a very tender image, but it's much more of an exterior image than a searching of the soul. That would be different from the painting he did of his longtime partner, Hendrika Stoffels, shortly after she died, where he portrayed her here as Lucretia. And the story of Lucretia must have hit home to Rembrandt in a number of different ways. Lucretia, Roman noblewoman, the wife of a general in the employ of the tyrants, hosts the tyrant and his son and other generals. The tyrant's son, Tarquin, develops a lust for her, steals back in the dead of night, is allowed in as he had been an honored guest, goes to her bedside and threatens her with a defamation. He would kill a slave next to her and then take her life and say that he found them together so that her family would absorb this embarrassment. Instead, she submits. She lets him into the bed. But the next day, she calls her father. She calls her husband. She explains what happened. Leads to the revolt against the tyrants, throwing the tyrants out of Rome. But she chooses to take her own life than to live sullied. And that's what we see here. That Lucretia holds the dagger in her hand, but with the other hand outstretched, she wrestles with the taking of her own life. And look at the poignancy of her expression, so characteristic of Rembrandt late in life. The understanding of the depth, the profound depth of human emotion. Now, he had lived with Hendrika since the 1640s. He was unable to marry her because he would have had to give up part of the inheritance from Saskia and her will. He had spent that money, so it wasn't possible at this point to marry. And so she was regularly condemned by the church and held outside of many of their rituals. And so he must have understood the parallel between Lucretia and Hendrika. And he did two paintings of her, one here and one in Minneapolis, and gives us a very strong representation of the latter part of Rembrandt's life. Rembrandt was among the few artists who continued to do narrative scenes, both of mythology and of the Bible. This story that unfolds in this small painting is of Bacchus and Philemon, an aged couple who lived in a small village on the other side of the river. And the story is a story that comes to us from Ovid, but it was a story that was often told in various different ancient narratives. Here, the gods come down to earth They're testing humanity to see if they're charitable, to see if they're generous. They're turned away at every door. They're disguised as mendicants. Nobody wants to have anything to do with them. And finally, they see this humble hut on the other side of the river, and they go. And they're not only let in, but the elderly couple invites them for a meal. And then, as they sit, the couple notices that the wine flask keeps refilling itself. They understand that they're in the presence of the divine. And so they go to catch the only thing they have of value, a goose. And just as they reach the goose, the gods reach out to protect the goose and reveal themselves. And so here, Jupiter and Mercury sit at the table, and that is divine illumination that is behind Mercury, as opposed to the not natural firelight that illuminates the rest of the cottage. So Rembrandt attempts to try and understand what it would be like to be a mortal in the presence of the divine, how you would react to something that was essentially supernatural, these two humble figures drawn back. The story ends nicely in Ovid, but Rembrandt had to use one image. He couldn't tell the whole story, it wasn't a series of boxes or cartoons. He has one image to try and sum it up. And so, in fact, what happens after this is that Mercury and Jupiter take the couple outside, and they watch as a deluge takes the rest of the village, and their home is made into a beautiful temple, and they are made the guardians of the temple. And the gods ask, "What would you like?" And after a conversation, they decide that they are so fond of each other, they're so enamored, that one doesn't want to live after the other has died, that they want to be taken together. And so when time passes, they're taken together and they are transformed. Ovid's Metamorphosis always deals in transformation. They are transformed into trees that give shelter to pilgrims that come to the church, to the temple. It's brought together in this way. Mythological and biblical stories were not as common as scenes of everyday life. In the hierarchy of 17th century art, the highest form of art was in many ways still narrative painting, history, the Bible, mythology, and then portraiture. And beneath that, landscape. The lower orders included scenes of everyday life and still life. And yet, oddly, it was within these areas that it was easiest to make a career. And artists specialized. So that in scenes of everyday life, there were artists who specialized in low life, peasant scenes, artists who specialized in middle class life, and artists who specialized in upper class life. One of the great artists that specialized in scenes of everyday life, although he did biblical scenes as well, was Jan Steen. And the gallery has this painting by Jan Steen from the period when he was in Haarlem, called The Dancing Couple. Parenthetically, I should mention to you that you should never derive too much information from the titles on the paintings. They're not often from the artist. They're usually titles of convenience. And so this is called The Dancing Couple. What could be more prosaic than calling it The Dancing Couple? There they are, dancing there in the center. And as we describe the painting, you can see that there are a lot of other people here which have led to various different interpretations. So that you can see that there is a church tower in the background and people who appear as if they might be clergy. So perhaps it's a wedding celebration. And perhaps those are parents to the lower right, or grandparents and parents over to the left. And we see the dancing couple. And I want you to look at the dancing couple very carefully and describe them to yourself. And so they're very different people. The woman is dressed in a better costume. She has a more restrained expression. She moves much more deliberately in the dance. The man is in a lower class costume, He has an expression of enthusiasm on his face. He literally kicks up his heels. They're two very different types, and it appears as if he might have been celebrating a bit too much, and she doesn't seem entirely happy with that. So that if this is indeed a couple, they might have some issues to work out. As you look at them, however, there are lots of other details that we might mention as well. The Dutch were fond of the use of emblem books. Emblem books were books of aphorisms that were illustrated with crude woodcuts or engravings that illustrated that small phrase. And the phrase generally had to do with proper ways of behavior, moral and ethical behavior. Think of it in terms of Poor Richard's Almanac that we were taught in school, the idea of a penny saved is a penny earned, or the squeaky wheel gets the most grease. But in Dutch culture, when you saw the illustration, you then thought of the aphorism, typically, for instance. This is an emblem, and it says, in Dutch, a full barrel rumbles not. A full barrel doesn't resound. The empty barrel makes the most noise. These are expressions they used as we use them today. So that when you see a barrel in a painting, you think about what it might represent. And so here are some of the details that you can see. And it is no accident the young man is above an empty barrel, as it is no accident that between their waists there is a rather phallic-looking pipe. And that pipe is continued down on the floor. And then near are broken eggs and spilled flowers, both symbols of the loss of innocence and perhaps of the wedding night, as the open shoe is the female counterpart to the pipe. And they would have understood these as suggestions about what was going on. There are two other details that I should point out to you, and that begins with the image that you see here on the left, which was a detail in the background, and that is all the way over there on the left. That's actually a self-portrait of the artist who suggests that he's part of this world, that he's not separate from it. He too looks a few sheets to the wind. And the detail all the way over to your right, which shows a little boy blowing bubbles, that has to do with the brevity of time on Earth, how ephemeral life is. And we'll talk more about this when we get to still life painting. Scenes of everyday life. Here, a middle-class family. A young girl comes in, she has a ball in her hand, she's been playing outside. Light not only comes from outside, but through the windows over to your left, highlighting the cleanliness of the floor, the careful arrangement, harmony of the furniture. The maid over there to the right is making a bed, a symbol of domestic harmony. And yet, there is something else here that the artist undoubtedly intended, and that is that right in the center of the painting, there's a cross. It's made up by the door frame and the window frame. It's unmistakable. And it's a reminder that all of their affluence, all of the wealth of the Dutch was based on a strong religious belief and on a society based on that as part of their values. We can suggest some of these same ideas when we go to the last topic we're going to discuss, and that's still life. This is a painting that dominates one wall. It is William Klaus Heyde's Still Life with a Mincemeat Pie, and it dates to 1635. Now, just as with portraiture, we have to ask ourselves several basic questions before we start to analyze a painting. With still life, we also have to ask a number of questions. First, are they the actual size of the objects so that we are led in the direction of trompe l'oeil, of fooling the eye? Are they the right color? Is there a consistent use of shadow to suggest illusionistically their three-dimensionality? So these are questions we ask. And we follow those questions by asking our vantage point. Are we looking from above so that all the objects are silhouetted by the table? Are we looking from table height so that one is in front of the next? Or at some variant height? And I think here you can see that we are at that varying height. We are perhaps what I would call chair height. And in this case, we are talking about a still life that is a meal. And there were a variety of different types of meals. There were breakfast pieces. There were others. This is called a pronk still life. It's a banquet still life. It's elaborate in terms of what's being eaten and the various different table settings. The Dutch never used the word still life. They used the various categories. So this is a banquet piece. And so the next question is, anytime you come to a meal, where are we in the course of that meal? And here it's clear that we're partway through. And we want to know who we're dining with. And it's clear that they're a wealthy family, that they can afford to have this brass candlestick on the left, the pewter pitcher, the gilded taza that's been turned over, the lidded cup with St. George on top, the glass which holds vinegar, probably made in Venice, the pewter salt cellar, as we read from left to right, and then those beautiful pewter plates and the Dutch roamers, glasses that are here as well. So we're eating clearly with a family that can afford to eat a mincemeat pie only eaten on special occasions, even by wealthy families, and that can afford to have olives and lemons, which are necessarily imported. This is a family of some wealth. And yet, we come back to where we are in the meal, and the meal is largely over. How have people been behaving? Not well. They've broken a glass over there to the right on the plate all the way to the right. They've turned over two other glasses. They've pushed up the tablecloth. They're not behaving very well. Perhaps they've overindulged in the material world. Yet, there's something on the table that hasn't been touched. Mincemeat pie is largely gone. The beer, mostly gone. No, right in the center of the painting, there's bread, and it hasn't been touched. It's been ignored. And that's because the bread stands in for belief in Christ and the afterlife. So these are people who have overindulged in the material world, but neglected this aspect. And once we see that, we can actually go back and see that lots of symbols are here that have to do with the brevity of life. The candle burnt out on the left. The lemon, having been peeled, it will rot soon enough. The plates that are on the edge of the table, teetering there. The broken glass, the fragility of life. Over there to the extreme right, that little rolled up piece of paper, held pepper. It in fact is an almanac page. All of these indicate the brevity of life. And there is one great symbol, one overwhelming symbol that suggests vanitas, that beauty, fame, and fortune are all ephemeral, but that the afterlife is eternal, and that you have to concentrate on this. That's the meaning of vanitas, which informs so many of these paintings. So look very carefully over at the picture that you see there on the left. I'll even go back to the detail. And you will see a human skull reflected. The skull is sideways. You can see the forehead with light on it, the eye sockets, and the lower part of the jaw. And you'll never actually look at the painting again in quite the same way. The great symbol of the frailty of the human foil. And then a very nice touch. How does he reveal the painter? He actually turns back the corner of the tablecloth, and that's where it's signed and dated, right there on the edge of the cloth. In 1995, the gallery realized under Wheelock's supervision, that there were no intimate spaces for the small scale of so many Dutch and Flemish paintings. And so out of a storeroom behind the main information room, they created the Dutch and Flemish cabinet galleries. And they've been here now close to 25 years. And those allowed us to get closer to paintings, to look at them as if they were in the home, in a more domestic setting. And as you see here, some of them have glass cases that allow us to put objects and prints and drawings in them as well. In celebration of the opening of the cabinet galleries, we acquired this painting by Adrian Brouwer. And that's important for us, but we'll have to wait for another time when we discuss Flemish painting in the collection. Instead, we have to go back to some of the greatest of the Dutch collection, and that is to go back to Vermeer. And we have 4 Vermeers in the collection. This one, perhaps the most prominent, from 1664, The Girl Holding a Balance. It is a painting that ostensibly is of everyday life, but in fact, there are a number of clues that lead us to a much deeper meaning intended on the part of Vermeer. Light pours through a window on the left. It's picked up on the wall, by the edge of the frame in the painting, by the cowl, by the blue jacket trimmed in fur, by the scales that are held in the young woman's hands. And on the table below, it's picked up by pearls, coins, bracelets, and jewelry. What is this painting really about? The painting is about balance in everyday life, and the way in which we can read that is to look at how the young woman is framed by the painting on the wall behind. We don't know who did that painting. Almost undoubtedly, Vermeer owned the painting. Vermeer's family owned the painting. But it gives us the direction for the real meaning of the painting, because it is Christ at the Last Judgment. So it's a painting about who will be saved and who will not. It's Christ weighing those souls as she holds the balance, and there is nothing on the balance. As she stares down at it, there are no jewels or coins. The painting is about temperance and balance in life, not about wealth represented on the table, but about the kind of thoughtful meditation that leads to a deeper spirituality. Here's a close-up so you can see the image of the painting in the background. Now, you've looked at the painting for a few moments, but there's a great aberration in this painting. Look at the frame on the painting in the background. Have you ever seen a frame which is gilded on one side and not on the other? Vermeer, who doesn't seem to have done drawings but worked more directly on canvas and on panel, gilded the frame on one side but didn't bother to put it down the center. Why? Because the hand and the scale need to be silhouetted against a dark background. And so that hand is precisely at the vanishing point in the painting. Look at the edge of the table, and it leads back to that hand. And the light strikes that hand because that's crucial to our understanding. Vermeer working both carefully and scientifically, but intuitively as well, and working up this brilliant enamel-like surface with careful brushstroke after brushstroke to give us this vision of contemplation, meditation in everyday life. We have additional paintings by Vermeer, and I'm glad to say that the woman writing on the right has been returned. It was out on loan. It's back up in the galleries as of this past week. And these two paintings, the girl in the red hat on the left and the girl with the flute on the right, possibly finished, planned by Vermeer, but finished by one of his children. It's attributed to Vermeer's hand, but the surface seems a little bit different. And through recent acquisitions, we've added this painting by Jacobus Vrel from about 1660, which seems to reflect some of Vermeer's concerns as well. As a young woman sits by the wall bed of an older woman watching over her. Notice the beautiful details of light playing across the various different plates and objects around the room. In the cabinet galleries, you will also find the largest array of still life paintings, including this early still life by Ambrosius Bosschaert, Flowers in a Glass Vase. It is signed and dated to 1621. It has the marvelous set of flowers that you can see. I'll list some of them for you. Yellow bearded iris, a red and white striped tulip, a bouquet that contains roses, a blue and white columbine, grape hyacinth, lily of the valley, forget-me-nots, globe flowers, and a sprig of rosary. And it contains also a butterfly, a red admiral butterfly down to the right. Bosschaert was among the first great still life painters. He apparently died around the time this painting was done. And you'll see that there is a plaque on the front. In French, it says, I'll give you the English translation, "This is the angelic hand of the great painter of flora, of nature, renowned even to the banks of the Moray River on the Gold Coast of Africa." That seems to have been added by perhaps one of his best pupils, Van der Ast, who added that in tribute to his master. And so we've seen elaborate still lives and fairly simple still lives, and anytime you see cut flowers in a Dutch image, that also suggests the ephemeral quality of life. They don't last very long. One of the recent acquisitions, and I'll end with two still lives, one of the recent acquisitions is this panel. And I mention this because we don't know the author of this panel. We don't even know if it's Dutch or Flemish. We prize it because of its artistry. It is, in fact, a small pine wood panel, illusionistically with an etching by Ferdinand Bol, one of Rembrandt's pupils. Not only is the etching trompe-l'oeil is illusionistic with all its folds and the shadows, but that stamp that is there, that wax stamp, is also painted on. And in fact, it is painted on an oak panel to look like pine wood. So all of the various different elements of the wood are also creations of illusion. We value it for the expertise with which it's done, even if we don't know who really did the work. In still life, finally, at the end of the century, we come to a great, if little-known master, Adrian Court. 1696, this still life with asparagus and red currants. No longer is it laden with symbolic meanings. It is Court realizing the texture and the feel of the asparagus, playing the color of the asparagus off against the currants. It is the pure artistry of the composition, of the design, and of technique. And so we celebrate Adrian Court in that way. There are a great many other paintings in the Dutch galleries that we weren't able to visit today. I'm glad we were able to touch on some of the most important masterpieces, and I'm glad that you were able to attend today or to watch live streaming. Thank you so much.